Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's seminar. My name is Ginger Sigmund, and I'm the Managing Director of ND Energy. Welcome to our second seminar in a four-part series on advancements in nuclear technology. If you missed last week's presentation on the fact, fiction, and future of nuclear power by Professor Peter Burns, you can view the recording on our website, energy.nd.edu. I hope you can also join us for our remaining talks, which we'll learn about the potential for micronuclear power plants in Puerto Rico next week on February 24th, and then other advances in nuclear science on March 3rd. We're very pleased to have Professor Don Howard with us this evening. In addition to serving in the philosophy department here on campus, he is a current fellow and former director of the Notre Dame Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values. He writes and teaches about the ethical, social, and policy impacts of science and technology. Howard is the co-founder of the International Science for the History of Philosophy of Science and the founding co-editor of its journal. Other research interests include the ethical and legal issues of cyber conflict and cybersecurity, as well as ethics of autonomous systems. Today's discussion will be based in part on a paper recently published in the Notre Dame Journal of Emerging Technologies entitled "The Moral Imperative of Green Nuclear Energy Production." Thank you very much for being here with this evening, Professor Howard, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ginger. I really appreciate the invitation to be speaking with you this evening about a subject about which, as you will see, I care very deeply. It's also a great pleasure to see many friends and students whom I haven't been able to see physically for a considerable time here in the room this evening. So that makes it even more special to me. And thank you also, Ginger, for mentioning that paper that I did a year ago in this brand new and really very interesting Notre Dame Journal for Emerging Technologies, which is being run by students in the Notre Dame Law School. It's a lot of hard work. They're doing an excellent job, and I encourage you to check out the journal. It's all online, all open source. It's a very cool thing. So let me set up my slides here. Give me a moment. And let's see if we're working here. There we go. So anyway, yes, the topic for this evening, nuclear technology, a moral imperative. I'm really delighted that Peter gave his talk last Wednesday evening. He covered a lot of the issues that I talk about in the paper, especially having to do with the environmental impacts of nuclear energy production, health and safety issues, waste disposal issues. I will indulge in the luxury of just touching upon those points really, really briefly as we go by, trusting Peter's excellent presentation about this. For those of you who weren't in the room last Wednesday, that talk is available on the ND Energy website. And if you want to get more detail about those technical issues, please take a look at Peter's presentation. Well, anyway, my job assignment for this evening is to talk about these issues from a moral perspective. And so let's start here with the challenge. It's a stark challenge and an important challenge. And it is simply that if we are to avoid catastrophic climate change by the end of this century, which means limiting global mean surface air temperature to 2 degrees centigrade above historical 20th century averages, then all the models show us that we have to completely decarbonize our energy economy. And that's going to include not just power production as you normally think about it. Remember, we're also electrifying our transportation system, which adds a huge additional demand for electricity. But we've got to decarbonize that entire energy economy. And we've got to try to do that by no later than 2065. That's what all the models tell us. That gives us barely 44 years to get this job done. So yes, we need the most rapid possible transition to a carbon-free energy economy. And the question is, how do we do that? And well, there are lots of tools in the toolkit, obviously. And without question, solar, wind, hydropower, geothermal, the entire array of green energy production technologies will play an important part in this going forward. And especially solar and wind power. Those are the real heavy lifters, aside from nuclear, which I'll be talking about in a moment. Those are the real heavy lifters in this very important enterprise. And make no mistake, even though I'm going to give you a passionate argument for an all-out push on nuclear power, I don't mean by that to imply that we should not be pushing as hard when it comes to solar and wind. Obviously, we should be moving ahead on all of these fronts. But one of the problems, and I think there's a lack of public understanding of these problems, is that nuclear can do things that solar and wind simply cannot do. And that's one of the most powerful reasons why nuclear energy is really the key to reaching this goal on time. So what are these things that solar and wind can't do? Well, let's start with what I call the transmission problem. So to put it bluntly, the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow in all the places where demand for electricity is the greatest. And we don't have a nationwide electricity transmission infrastructure adequate to the task of moving the electricity from the windy Great Plains and the sunny desert Southwest to Chicago, New York, Boston, Atlanta, Miami, and so forth. We're certainly going to work on improving that transmission infrastructure. We absolutely have to do that, also for the purposes of taking full advantage of nuclear. But that's going to cost a lot of money. And at the moment, we're still not seeing a lot of movement in the direction of a rapid expansion of capacity and in the direction of making that transmission infrastructure robust in the way it must be. And of course, the experience of Texas in the past few days is only the most recent reminder of just how crude are some parts of our electricity transmission infrastructure. So that's the transmission problem. We can make electricity with wind and solar, but we can't make it as well in the places where it's really maximally needed. There's a second problem, and that is what we call the baseload problem. So even in the windy and sunny places, the wind doesn't blow at a constant speed and the sun doesn't always shine, especially not at night, which means that output from wind and solar tends to vary pretty significantly. Whereas the base load, which is the normal, regular, minimum electricity demand, 24/7, that remains more or less constant. And we are nowhere nearly capable of meeting that base load with solar and wind. And what's more, some back of the envelope calculations, I run some of these numbers in the paper if you're interested, make it clear that we're probably never going to be able to meet this baseload challenge just with solar and wind. If we had a much more sophisticated storage battery technology, that could even out this supply curve. But there again, though progress is being made, we're a long way away from the kind of storage capacity that would really be needed to solve this problem. So what do we do? Well, my answer is that next generation nuclear power production solves all of these problems and more. So nuclear solves the baseload problem, just as coal and natural gas do, because we can generate electricity at constant levels 24/7 with nuclear power, unlike wind and solar. So it solves the baseload problem. It also solves this location transmission problem. Why? Because we can build nuclear facilities anywhere we need them. We're not constrained to build them only close to where the uranium is to be mined and processed, for example. So we don't have the same transmission problem. Furthermore, next generation nuclear power plants are scalable, meaning that we can build large plants, small plants, anything in between, whatever is the need, wherever is the need. We can meet it with next generation nuclear power. And as Peter talked about last Wednesday, this technology has advanced so far, and especially with what we call small modular nuclear power production units. It is advanced to the point where we can build them small enough to power just an individual factory, small enough to put them on a truck and deliver them anywhere they're needed. We're not talking any longer about nuclear only in the form of the ginormous nuclear power plants that most of us think about when we conjure up the image of nuclear power. And then lastly, and again, Peter talked about this quite compellingly last Wednesday, nuclear power is safe and cost effective. Ever so briefly, to reiterate some of the points that Peter made, yes, there have been a few significant accidents involving nuclear power production, the worst having been the Chernobyl accident a few years ago. But the numbers of people who were sickened and died in those accidents are in fact really very small. And especially if you compare those casualties to the number of people who are sickened and die because of electricity production by burning coal and natural gas. Coal especially is an incredible killer. Literally millions of extra fatalities every year, primarily from particulate emissions from coal-fired power plants. So yes, there is a health and safety risk, as there is with any technology, but especially when compared with the way we make electricity now, nuclear has an incredible safety track record. So the question then becomes, why aren't we moving ahead more rapidly with nuclear power? Other nations of the world are investing heavily and are being really aggressive in building out their nuclear capabilities. China and India have committed to doing this. China, of course, and India both still have a long way to go because they burn a lot of coal to make electricity. But they've recognized the importance of trying to transition to a nuclear energy economy. France has long been a world leader. For decades, virtually all of the electricity produced in France has been produced by nuclear power. Similar story in Sweden, going back decades. And there are new players getting into the game. Especially interesting is the fact that Saudi Arabia, that has grown rich and powerful as an oil producing nation, they've seen what's coming, and they are now starting to build an indigenous nuclear power capability. So the question is, why, even though the United States is still the world leader in the percentage of electricity that we make with nuclear power, we make about 20% of our electricity with nuclear. And by the way, in this immediate region, served by the Indiana-Michigan Power Company, roughly half of our electricity is made comes from nuclear power. But curiously, the US hasn't been investing as heavily in nuclear over the past 20 to 30 years, as have so many other nations around the world. So what are the sources of the problem here in the United States? Well, there are at least four big impediments, four things that are holding us back. One is the regulatory environment in the United States, especially in the wake of the 3 Mile Island accident that Peter talked about on Wednesday. We made changes to our regulatory structures such that they're now not as, there's not as smooth a path to licensing a new nuclear power plant as one might hope there would be. For a lot of power companies, for a lot of corporations like General Electric, that was long a major leader in building nuclear power plants, these impediments posed by the regulatory environment are really slowing us down. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not arguing that we should significantly weaken that regulatory structure. What I think we need to do is to rethink that regulatory structure, partly in view of the new developments in nuclear power generation. And again, I point to the talk that Peter gave last Wednesday, where when he was talking about small modular reactors, he made the very important point that if you build your reactors in that form, if you have a centralized factory for building reactors, which in finished form you then ship to whatever site you're going to install them, if you make reactors that way, then you need to license the design only once, and you don't have to go through the licensing procedure every time you build a new nuclear facility. That by itself should lead to significant changes in our regulatory infrastructure here in the US. Of course, another major problem is public fear of nuclear power, largely driven by the media, but abetted in many cases by social media rumor mills, self-appointed pundits who make a career out of being not always maximally well-informed critics of nuclear power. Public perceptions of risk are another huge impediment to our pushing harder to a nuclear energy future. A third factor, follow the money. Natural gas and coal industries, they recognize the threat all too well that nuclear energy poses, and they are spending megabucks to try to do whatever they can to throw up more roadblocks to the expansion of our nuclear capabilities. And then lastly, though there are many other issues we could talk about here, and this again is something that Peter spoke about last Wednesday, is for the most part, just nakedly political reasons, we still don't have adequate long-term storage facilities for nuclear waste. In my view, this is a huge scandal that we could now be roughly 70 years into, or 65 years into commercial nuclear power production in this country, and we still haven't solved the problem of permanent or long-term safe waste storage. Peter mentioned on Wednesday that the standard drill to this day in the US is that once the spent fuel is removed from a reactor, it's cooled for a period of time in water tanks, and then it's dried, and then it's moved into typically concrete storage casks that remain on the power plant site. If people really understood what a problem that represents, I mean, thankfully we haven't had any serious accidents with that, but that's an inherently problematic way. It's not a sustainable long-term solution for storing nuclear waste. But of course, we thought we were on our way to solving this problem decades ago with the Yucca Mountain storage facility. But as Peter reminded us last Wednesday, one of Obama's first acts when he took office in 2009 was he repaid Harry Reid for delivering the presidential vote in Nevada by canceling the Yucca Mountain project. Anyway, that's another huge problem that we have to deal with. But as I said, my charge is to talk about the moral imperative here. And so what are our options for moving forward? Well, I think you can divide them up into basically three options. When you survey the entire energy production landscape, all of the technologies that are available, it boils down to just three possible courses of action. And the first is to do nothing, which just dooms the planet. If we don't get control of the problem of global climate change, then we're toast. Or a second option is we could continue down the path sketched out in the Paris Agreement by doing a mix of different things, expanding wind and solar as rapidly as possible, reducing energy consumption, developing new approaches to CO2 capture and sequestration, and this is the part of this scenario that people don't want to talk about, and hoping, perhaps against hope, for some miraculous technological breakthrough. Maybe when it comes to capture and sequestration, maybe when it comes to better storage battery technologies. But you don't make long-term policy on the basis of a hope and a prayer, which I'm sorry to say is really sort of what we're doing with this path that we have sketched. This is going to lessen the impact of climate change, but without still more radical changes, it's going to leave a world for our children and grandchildren that's dramatically different from the world we know. It's going to be far less hospitable, and those who survive will lead seriously diminished lives. Which brings us to the third possibility. As I survey the possibilities, the only proven path forward that's, to use a hackneyed phrase, shovel ready, the only proven path forward that we know can get us to a totally decarbonized energy economy by 2065, the only path forward is a concerted global effort to expand nuclear energy production as rapidly as possible. It's the only path forward that is guaranteed to get us to that goal. But at the moment, we're not heading that way. A lot of smart people are working on important technical issues in this area. There's a slowly developing policy discussion, but we're really not investing in nuclear to the extent that we must if we really want to assure a future for our children and our grandchildren. So let's turn and ask the question, what are some of the most common ethical objections to nuclear power? And when you scour the literature, and again, don't look at the hype, just look at the people who have tried to be a little bit more sober and a little bit more evidence-driven, survey the philosophy journals, survey the other sources. One of the things that you'll find, I think, as I found when I was doing the research for the paper, is that in spite of all the public fear, in spite of all of the impediments to a rapid expansion of nuclear power, the arguments, the ethical arguments against our doing that are hard to find, and they tend to be pretty feeble arguments. So let me illustrate with this admittedly somewhat old document. It's the Unitarian Universalist Association's 1976 Social Justice Statement on Nuclear Power, a document that still gets cited in lots of different places. When you work your way through it, you find that in the end, their argument against the expansion of nuclear power production boils down to 3 points. And I'm literally quoting now here from the document. And the first point they raise is the high probability that many people would be exposed to low-level radiation, an eventuality which is known to cause birth defects and to result in deaths from cancer, usually after time delays of years. Again, Peter spoke directly to this point last Wednesday. One of the arguments that he made, and he's spot on in my opinion, is that it's simply false to claim that exposure to low-level radiation will cause birth defects and result in deaths from cancer. Now, I don't want to go too far in the weeds and repeat too much of what Peter said last Wednesday, but he made the key point, which is that those who think that this is true are really working on the basis of a model for estimating risk from exposure to radiation that's called the linear no threshold model. And it's really strange how we came to apply that model. So the only real data we have is data from survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks. And we've got tons of data there. But that's data about comparatively high-level exposure to radiation. What was done when that data was used to try to make estimates of the risk of low-level exposure? It was simply this. They took the data points for the high-level exposure, where you're plotting the number of deaths, for example, or the number of cancers against the amount of exposure. And we have data points only up at the high end there. And then just draw a straight line back to the origin and just assumed that that was the shape of the curve. It may be the shape of the curve, as Peter told us last week, but the crucial point is we don't know. We don't have the data. There is no data out there that would confirm this claim. Another point here is what would be the level of exposure to low-level radiation? A lot of people live in fear of living near a nuclear power plant. Well, in one way, we've been taking a lot of data for 65 years in the form of all the operators of these nuclear power plants. They're exposed to low levels of radiation, though it's higher than the exposure of people who live in surrounding communities. And the health data from the operators of these plants doesn't support this claim either. So that was one of their arguments. Here's a second argument that they put forward. They speak of the highly probable exposure of future generations to the lethal effects of the long-lived radioactive waste products inevitably produced by nuclear power plants. Well, of course, it's true that spent fuel contains a lot of nasty stuff, and that if it were not properly handled, then it could make people sick and it could kill people. But, I'm being waved at by an old friend here. But this assumes that we're going to do nothing about the waste disposal problem, which is not true. We haven't done what we should, and especially not in the US. But still, we have found a cobbled together solution with on-site medium-term storage that has prevented this kind of exposure to future generations. Now, of course, some of these isotopes are going to live for tens of thousands of years, and we can't predict the future. And we certainly can't do it when it comes to casks containing nuclear waste on reactor sites. So maybe there's a chance of some health effects 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now. I don't mean to downplay that. at all. But we know how to build reliable, safe, long-term storage facilities. So this needn't be a problem either. The third argument they advanced in this document, I found to be the most curious argument. But again, I'm just literally quoting from the document. They spoke of uncertainty in regard to the likelihood of catastrophic release of radioactive materials into the environment because estimates of quote unquote, I love the scare quotes here, nuclear safety published by the nuclear power industry and its government sponsors neglect the dangers resulting from defects in construction and the lack of an adequate program for training nuclear power plant inspectors and operators. In all honesty, I have no idea where that argument came from. None whatsoever. So to cut to the chase here, 70 years of experience, 65 years of experience with nuclear power plants just shows these concerns to be ungrounded. I have friends and family members who have served in the nuclear Navy, have been nuclear engineers on aircraft carriers and submarines. And it's really interesting to talk to them about this kind of argument because they will point out that there have been very, very few accidents with the kinds of reactors that we put on our ships. And what's more, they speak with genuine pride about the degree of professionalism in that part of the Navy. They are extraordinarily well trained and they do their jobs extraordinarily well. And on the whole, the track record with commercial nuclear reactors has been similar to that. Yes, there have been accidents. Yes, there have been personnel issues, but taking a long view, it simply hasn't been a problem. So that's what at least one document said about possible health and safety concerns. Another kind of issue that comes up in the literature on the ethics of nuclear power has to do with social and environmental justice issues. There's a lot that we could discuss in this space. We don't have the time for that. So let me just focus on one issue that comes up again and again and again, especially in the still scant philosophical literature on the ethics of nuclear energy, as represented by this 2015 collection of papers. That's actually a pretty good collection of papers. It's worth one's time and effort. Many of the contributors to this volume, in one way or another, brought up similar concerns about such differential impacts as the consequences of siting decisions on marginalized and under-resourced communities. That is the argument that there's something inherent in the sort of logic of the nuclear energy industry that will have us situating nuclear production facilities and waste disposal facilities in places and ways that will pose a significantly greater risk to people of color, to people living in economically deprived communities. This was in fact a major issue in the political debate around the choice of Yucca Mountain for long-term nuclear waste disposal. There aren't a lot of rich people living in that corner of Nevada. And it was argued by many critics of the decision that this was just a classic case of our dumping our waste and putting at risk on people who had no voice, had no ability to themselves act politically to try to protect themselves against such problems. Well, this is of course a huge issue, and it's an all too common issue, and it's a well-known issue. But the point that I would emphasize is that these legitimate concerns are in no way unique to nuclear. We do exactly the same thing when it comes to our decisions about where to build a coal-fired power plant. We do this in other sectors of our economy. We do the same sort of thing in deciding where to build highly toxic chemical facilities. There's nothing unique to nuclear here. It's a real problem, and it really has to be addressed. And we need to think long and hard about how we democratize these decision-making processes, how we provide a proper voice to those who are going to be most affected. There's no denying that. But the mistake in the argument is to suggest that this is somehow importantly different in the case of nuclear energy, when it is not. And history is replete with examples of huge environmental disasters that affected hundreds and thousands of people that were a consequence of, for example, our building a coal ash retention pond in a desperately poor rural area where it's not properly maintained and monitored. You get a breach, it floods thousands of acres of farmland, displaces lots and lots of people. That sort of thing happens even more with really dirty forms of energy production like coal. So again, I don't want to downplay this for a moment. It's serious, but the key point is it's in no way unique to nuclear. Well, let's turn our attention in a different direction. Those were some of the most commonly encountered ethical objections to nuclear power. What are the most powerful ethical arguments for an all-out push for nuclear power? Well, of course, obviously, I think the overwhelmingly important argument is that if we don't go this route, there's going to be hell to pay for it. But instead of my putting the point in that sort of breezy way, let me try to dress the point up, pretending for the moment to be a somewhat more sophisticated philosopher speaking in a more erudite philosophical vocabulary. And let me talk to you about two of the frameworks for ethical decision-making that are discussed in the literature on normative ethics. The two, there are a number, but I want to pick the two that I think are most pertinent to this conversation. And you'll forgive me for getting a little bit philosophical and going just a little bit into the weeds here, but there are tons of interesting questions here. The first framework that I want to talk about briefly is what's known as the consequentialist framework. You perhaps know this better under the term utilitarianism. It's a point of view in ethics that was developed in the 19th century in Britain. Its most famous proponent is the 19th century British political philosopher, ethicist, logician, John Stuart Mill. What's the key idea in the consequentialist framework? It is that you judge the morality of an act or a policy solely on the basis of the consequences of that act, hence the name, consequentialism. Other ethical frameworks, like the point of view associated with the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, the point of view called deontology, it emphasizes things like always acting with right intention. And again, I don't have any time to talk about that framework. But the consequentialist approach says, no. The intentions with which an actor undertook an action really aren't critically relevant to assessing the morality of the act. Okay, we judge the morality of the act solely on the basis of the consequences. How do we do that? Well, the famous rule of consequentialism is that we choose the alternative that conduces to the greatest good for the greatest number. Or another way the point is sometimes put is you choose the course of action that minimizes suffering and maximizes happiness. Sometimes this takes the form of a literal mathematical calculation. We call this cost-benefit analysis, where we do what I think is seriously conceptually problematic, namely reducing all human happiness and all human suffering to some one numerical metric. Typically, we try to monetize all of that. We attach a dollar value to happiness and suffering, but then we just run the calculation and see which course of action minimizes suffering and maximizes happiness. It's a very intuitive framework. Many of us, without even thinking about it, probably default to this way of thinking about a lot of our ethical judgments. But in fairness, it has to be admitted that there are some serious classical problems with the consequentialist framework. So let me just share with you a few of them, not all of them. So first of all is the question, whose happiness and suffering do we have to evaluate? We often divide this into what we call the spatial problem and the temporal problem. Do we pay attention to the potential happiness and suffering of, say, everyone on the planet? Or do we extend our moral concern only to those near and dear to us? Maybe our community, maybe my nation. That's the spatial part. The temporal part is how far into the future do we go when we're trying to evaluate the harms and goods to others of actions we undertake today? We all think we've got obligations to our children, probably to our grandchildren, but do we really have obligations to care about the well-being of our great-grandchildren and still more distantly removed generations? Most of us probably don't think that way. We tend not to regard the happiness and suffering of people on the other side of the planet equally with ours, and likewise when it comes to the distant unborn. In other words, most of us probably weight suffering differently, depending upon the location and space and time of the individual in question. When you do cost-benefit analysis, there's a technical term for this. It's called discounting. You've got elaborate formula according to which you decide that the discount rate from one generation to the next is going to be maybe 7% or something like that. It gives the illusion of objectivity to the moral calculation, but it really obscures the radical subjectivity that's involved. People also talk about what's called calculational intractability. Even if you got solutions to the problems that I just mentioned, there are so many people potentially affected that it's not even clear that you can really do the calculation. And then lastly, and I already alluded to this concern, is the lack of objective metrics. So if we're going to compare happiness and suffering, we got to have a metric. But does it really even make sense to try to compare the pleasure of a full belly against the pleasure of reading a good book? You know, when you say it that way, it seems pretty clear that that's a problematic assumption. So I really want to be honest with you about the fact that there are serious conceptual problems with this framework. Nonetheless, I think that in the case of climate change and the pursuit of nuclear power as a promising way of solving the problem, I think this is one case where the considerations are so clear that even these more technical philosophical worries about this framework aren't really all that pertinent. Why not? Well, just to rehearse part of what I've said before, the only guaranteed way to decarbonize the economy by 2065 and thus to preserve a habitable planet for future generations is through this rapid expansion of nuclear power. It simply can't be done by solar and wind alone, by capture and sequestration, so on and so forth. In this case, in spite of my reservations, theoretical reservations about the framework, the result of the calculation is just obvious and hugely compelling. Only the most rapid possible expansion of nuclear can guarantee a world in which future generations can flourish rather than languish and die. It's really that simple. The one other framework I want to talk about, and then we will wrap this up, is what's called the virtue ethics framework. This is an ancient point of view in ethics, goes all the way to back to Greek antiquity. There are also Buddhist and Confucian versions of virtue ethics going way, way back millennia. It had fallen out of favor for a long time, but in the last 40 years, it has come roaring back to the point where it is now arguably, certainly in some circles, emerging as the most important framework for ethical decision-making. As it happens, there's a special connection between that phenomenon and Notre Dame, because what really kicked off the revival of virtue ethics was the publication in 1982 of a book called After Virtue by our longtime and now emeritus Notre Dame colleague in the philosophy department, Alistair McIntyre. And so there are a lot of people here at Notre Dame who find themselves thinking in this space of virtue ethics. What's the key idea here? So unlike consequentialism, which says that the first question is simply the question about the moral status of an act or a policy, unlike consequentialism, the virtue ethics tradition asks us to think in the first place, not exclusively, but in the first place, about the moral characters of the principal actors involved. Okay, what does it mean to think about moral character? Well, in this tradition, we think of moral character as a collection of what we call virtues. What are the virtues? They are settled habits of thought and action that are conducive to individual and collective human flourishing. So when you're thinking your way into such a space, ask first, what kinds of people do you want making the decisions, doing the engineering, making the policy, making consumer choices, and what kinds of habits of action and thought do those individuals bring to the task? One other technical point, when you ask about individual virtues, it's argued that where a virtue lives is always on a spectrum, at the ends of which are corresponding vices. The example that Aristotle gave and that we all start with is the virtue of courage, where the claim is that courage lives between the vice of timidity on one extreme and rashness on the other extreme. Where exactly it's to be located in between depends a lot on local circumstance. For one and the same individual, there might be some situations that call for a little bit more boldness, and there are other situations where courage demands a little bit more reserve of us. There are objections to virtue ethics, as there are objections to consequentialism. One of the most important is what constitutes human flourishing, and is what we take to be human flourishing relative to context and culture. Does flourishing in one part of the world mean something different from flourishing in another part of the world? And closely related to that is the question of exactly how we locate the mean between the extremes. Some critics argue that this kind of problem is so severe that it opens up the threat of radical relativism in ethics if we let context play too large a role. I don't think that's the case, but again, we don't have time to go into the somewhat protracted argument about why I think that's a misplaced concern. What do we do with this framework in connection with questions like the questions we're talking about here regarding nuclear power? Well, it's a really interesting phenomenon that one of the places where virtue ethics has in the past 20 years really found a foothold is in thinking about technology ethics. Perhaps the main reason for that has to do with one of the problems with consequentialism that I mentioned earlier, namely that well, actually, I didn't say this. Let me now say it. In a world where technology is changing ever more rapidly, you have ever greater challenges in trying just to foresee what the consequences of your actions are going to be. This philosopher, Shannon Valor, calls that problem the problem of acute technosocial opacity. And she argues, and I'm totally on her side with this, that if we do face an increased challenge of trying to anticipate the consequences of our actions, and if that makes problematic a consequentialist moral calculation, then perhaps it makes sense to make the basic virtue ethics move and direct our attention in the first instance to the question of the moral character of the actors in the space. She published a fantastic book in 2015 called Technology and the Virtues. It's arguably my favorite book in this entire space. It's beautifully written. If you ever want to read just one thing in this entire space, read Shannon's book, Technology and the Virtues. She develops a really long list of virtues that she calls techno-moral virtues, that are the virtues specific to the practice of technologists, scientists, regulators, policymakers, and the public who are engaged with technology. In other words, those virtues that are especially appropriate in this domain. We don't have the time to go through the whole long list. There are really interesting discussions of all of these in the book. What I wanted to do to conclude is to focus in on just one of her core techno-moral virtues. And that's the one you see on the bottom left here, courage, which again, is the example we've all started with since the time of Aristotle. What will we say about courage as a techno-moral virtue when we organize our thinking about how to move forward in this very challenging space of climate change and decarbonizing the economy? Well, I'll conclude with this point. I think that you can say about those critics of nuclear energy, whom I just quoted a few minutes ago, that then when they think about this and act as moral agents, they err on the side of timidity. Remember, courage lives between the extremes of rashness and timidity. They're too afraid. Now, they would say in response to that, they do say in response to that, no, this is not timidity. This is well-warranted prudence or caution, which they think is a virtue. And of course, prudence and caution are virtues. The moral challenge, I think, from the virtue ethics point of view, is again to find this sweet spot, the appropriate mean between rashness and timidity. And my concluding thought is simply this, that the argument from virtue leads us to the conclusion that the aggressive expansion of nuclear power, mindful of risk and precaution, is the properly courageous response to the challenge of anthropogenic climate change. And that if anything is crucially needed in this discussion, it's all of us together trying to find the right way to act and to think together in a way that's properly reflective of the kind of intellectual and moral courage that's critically required here. Well, I will stop. Thank you very much for your patience and your attention, and I'd be delighted to hear your thoughts or your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Howard, for a very thoughtful discussion. I'll open the floor to questions if you want to use the raise hand function or type in the chat.
And can you help Ginger to monitor? I can't see everybody on the screen at one time.
Correct, I will do so. Great. Are there any questions? Okay, Ani?
Thank you, Ginger, and thank you, Don. I'm teaching a class in energy this semester, and I've made it a point that we have all these realizations, we have the facts in hand. How do we go to action? Mm-hmm. And how can we enable this moral imperative to take place. I feel that it's beyond time of just talking about what's right to do. How do we go about doing it?
Well, let me begin by telling you what we don't do, okay? So a lot of people who work in the space of technology ethics think that the most important thing to do is to put facts in the hands of the public. And there's a technical name for this view. It's called the deficit model. The idea is that people aren't doing the right thing because they lack the kind of knowledge that they need to act rightly. A lot of us think that the deficit model is just fundamentally wrong. Of course, we want to educate people. Of course, we want to be, as scientists and engineers, better communicators. Of course, we want to put information in the hands of the people who have to make political choices. That goes without saying, but it's not at all obvious that doing that is sufficient for bringing about real change. My own view of this is that while there are lots of different actors who have to make many, many different contributions to this, the really crucial issue is political leadership. And I am waiting with bated breath to see what Joe Biden does with the leadership of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I think that's going to be a really telling indicator of whether or not he really gets it when he talks about bringing us back into the Paris Accords and taking aggressive action to move forward. And if I were to choose any one place to target interventions, I would do it right there. Now, a very heartening development was that after Trump had basically depopulated the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, one of Biden's very first moves was to bring a lot of really, really superb new people on board to beef up that office again. It is the office that is supposed to provide the best advice to the administration. So that's already a good signal. But I'm still waiting to see what he does with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So short answer, educate everybody the best we can, but focus one's energies politically. And that means not just as individuals. I'm also talking about professional associations. I've long been really impressed with the kind of leadership that the American Physical Society has shown on issues of this kind. So that's another place where people like you and me, Ani, could concentrate our attention. Anyway, thank you for that question. Hugely important.
I've just been asked to join a national steering committee on science, engagement of the public in science. This is funded by Department of Energy as well as the Kavli Foundation. And they're basically looking for lessons that work. I mean, we've been doing all of this for years and years. So now the question is, what works? So if anyone who's joined this seminar has any ideas, I'd be happy to hear from you.
So I'd be happy to talk with you offline, Ani, about a couple of historical episodes that I think are really worth thinking more carefully about in exactly this connection. And just very, very briefly, I like to go back to that moment in history when we established the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and some of the other professional structures that grew up around that as exemplary moments in the efforts of technical communities to engage the public in a sophisticated but understandable way. And I think some of that work made a difference for the good in the 50s and 60s in helping us to get control of the arms race.
Yep, Peter?
I don't know how to raise my hand electronically, so I just raised my hand. And thanks, Don. That was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I think it's remarkable in a way that so many of us can speak the same language, being from such different backgrounds on this important subject. But something I wanted to ask you about, it's kind of more like a request for advice. I spent, well, half of my life, I guess, studying energy and issues related to supply and nuclear and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, I run into colleagues regularly at Notre Dame and elsewhere who have spent their life studying, I don't know, Thomas Lawrence or something, or whatever, right? And know virtually nothing, probably, about realities of energy, but they distrust me. When I say we cannot power Notre Dame with solar panels, they don't believe me. They tell me I'm crazy or that I'm somehow biased or whatever. How do I respond to these allegations?
There are at least two dimensions to the problem. So first of all, it's not you, okay? This is emblematic of a much more widespread phenomenon of the increased distrust of expertise. And in the science technology studies literature, there's actually a lot of interesting literature about this as a social phenomenon. Also a really interesting philosophical literature about how you even define expertise, what the role of expertise ought to be in policymaking. So you're confronting a problem that lots of people are confronting. That doesn't solve your problem, of course, knowing that you've got company. I think that when it comes to those individual encounters, the only thing to do is to respect the opinion, but to be straightforward and just trying to lay out the facts politely, respectfully, but consistently and clearly. And to do it in a way that can't be misinterpreted. And by the way, this is not a criticism of you, because this isn't you, but we all know examples of this kind. Do it in a way that doesn't get misread by the other person as some kind of arrogant condescension from the point of view of the technical specialist. Some of us have to work hard on that. My philosophy colleagues are especially challenged on this front because they think they know everything. But again, I think that's the other key thing is just, you got to build trust. And one way you build trust is spending time talking with people and just saying, well, let me show you this and let me show you that. And even our colleagues in all the humanities departments can understand simple arithmetic. And it's really just simple arithmetic in most cases, you know.
Right.
Well, Donna, thanks for that response. I seldom get much beyond the first 2 or 3 exchanges in these things, and I don't find I typically get a chance to actually sit down and explain my my thoughts in any kind of detail. But anyway, I'll let other people ask questions too.
Joseph, did you have a question? Yes, Joseph.
You're muted, Joe. You're muted,
Yep.
Joe.
Joseph, you're muted.
Now you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
I actually wanted to suggest an ethical argument.
Good.
And it's got to do with nuclear power versus fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument is based on the notion of who gains and who pays the price. Mm-hmm. And typically what happens with the fossil fuels is that the general populace gains, they get electricity from it, mm-hmm. but it's the local folks where coal is mined or coal is burned or oil is drilled that pay the penalty in terms of environmental effects. A classic example is the Four Corners power plants.
Yeah, right.
That feed Los Angeles and Phoenix, you know, and that sort of thing. So my argument goes this way. If you use nuclear power and you consider the possibility of a catastrophic failure, okay, the catastrophic failure means that everyone bears the risk. Everyone gains and everyone bears the risk. So ethically speaking, from that point of view, nuclear power is a better idea than fossil fuels.
So from one point of view, this is an instance of that issue that I talked about under the heading of social and environmental justice that has to do with things like just how you decide where you're going to situate these facilities. And thanks for reminding us about the Four Corners case, which was really a classic example of exactly that phenomenon. But while I would urge the importance of that consideration, I'd also push back a little bit in this respect. Yes, those in the immediate vicinity of such a facility are at greater risk than those who are at some remove. But especially when it comes to coal, and to a lesser extent, but still significantly when it comes to natural gas, but especially when it comes to burning coal, the really serious health effects are not confined to the immediate local vicinity, because those particulates get up into the atmosphere and they're carried for tens of miles and hundreds of miles.
Well, yeah, well, maybe. I mean, the data that I recall, and I haven't looked at this in a long time, is that the majority of the particulate matter settles downwind of the I mean, it depends. A lot depends on how tall the stacks are.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And
okay.
How strong the prevailing winds are, and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, but the majority of the particulate matter settles out 30 to 50 miles downwind of the plant.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't go farther than that. So if the plant, you know, I mean, if the plant's 100 miles from New York City, then New York City isn't affected by it. Of course, New York's got all its own particulate matter. One other comment I wanted to make in response to trying to sit down and have a factual conversation with someone to try to convince them of the value of your thinking. And what comes to mind are the conversations that had to do with creationism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that there what you've got are people who have a belief structure that is really not amenable to rational conversation. The best thing to do with them that I found, talking to people about it, is to not have the conversation, not to get drawn into it.
From the point of view of self-therapy, that could very well be a wise advice. And I get your point about the felt quality of the interaction, but there is this difference. Here we're not dealing with arguments driven by dogma of some kind or another, or at least not theological dogma. And so I think it's actually a little bit more difficult a problem than trying to argue with the ardent creationists, whose minds are probably never going to change. If I could go back to the earlier point, have you ever been in Beijing?
No.
There are no coal-fired power plants in Beijing, but the air in Beijing is unbelievably dirty. Even today, I was just there in November. I've had experience of this. November of 1919, not 1920 or 2020. That soot from the power plants is traveling a really long distance. Now, some of that has to do with the local meteorological and topographic character of that part of China. But lots of really wealthy people in Beijing are sickened by the soot from those power plants.
Ah.
All right, so we'll move on to one last question. Nirupama?
Hi, Don. Thank you.
Nirupama. Good to hear you.
Hi, Don. Thank you.
Good to see you.
I thank you for the really great presentation. I actually had a question regarding what you were talking about the communication gap between us as scientists and the society. So I have been a part of various public awareness programs. I have worked with different students and scientists in the US and other countries. And I realized that as scientists, we are all really good. We really know our science. We know how to work in the lab. We know the research. We know the facts. We just don't know how to communicate it properly to to someone who does not have that basic knowledge of how a nuclear reactor works, or the basic knowledge of just how physics works. After working with all these different people, I felt that it's not science that is lacking. It is our training in how to communicate with all these people. I have been at Notre Dame for almost 6 years now. I have been trained to how to do my research. I've never been trained on how to talk to the public, how to communicate my research. I've never been trained to accept the fact that just doing research is not enough. It is also equally important to be able to communicate it to everyone. So I guess my question is, what can we do at the level of university or at the institutional level to recognize the importance of communication, to encourage more students who are in the field to go out there, talk to the people, and talk in a way that we can actually help convince them. Yeah, that's
No, I wholeheartedly agree. We don't do enough at all by way of training our, especially our graduate students and our young colleagues in science and engineering and science communication. It's a crying need. As you know, Nirupama, we've tried to do some little things with some of these NSF-funded projects that we've done over the past 7 or 8 years that did include some units on science communication, but it's just a drop in the bucket. It's a much bigger challenge. And I don't have a simple, easy solution to the problem, but for everybody else in the room, I do have a suggestion. If you want to see this kind of science communication done really, really well, then Nirupama was displaying false modesty here. You have to go check out her website and magazine called Nuclear Energy, the Better Energy, which is wonderful and was conceived and has been carried on now for, I guess we're entering the 3rd or 4th year, precisely as a way to address this challenge. What's more, Nirupama is always looking for people to join that team. So if you want to train yourself better as a science communicator, you can apprentice yourself to Nirupama and her really cool group of colleagues. And I'm really sincere about this. It's really, really well done. It's just called Google, Nuclear Energy, the Better Energy, and you'll be led immediately to it. And I'm really proud that this is a Notre Dame physics graduate student who's taken on this challenge.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Howard, and thank you for all joining us this evening. I hope you can join us next week. We'll be learning about installing micronuclear reactors in Puerto Rico. So I will stay on for a little longer if there are any more questions. If not, have a great evening.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.